Um, so I am doing another tag that was created by Cliff's Dark Gems, and I actually saw this through Michael Wertenberg, which I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, and I'll tag them both. This is, I think, based on Robert McCammon's book Swan Song, but it doesn't have to be McCammon books, which is good because I've never read anything by him. But Cliff had created this tag, and so I am going to do it. And it is a series of prompts that obviously were inspired by Swan Song, but I don't think I have any horror, or not too much horror on here, so it'll be kind of cross-genre. So the first prompt is The End of the World, and it is a book with an abrupt ending. And I actually struggled with this at first. I was going to do I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which has a somewhat abrupt ending, and I've also obviously talked about it a million times. So I decided to go with something I read fairly recently that does have also an abrupt ending, and that is Brother and Sister Enter the Forest by Richard Mirabella. Like I said, I talked about this before a little bit on a recent recap, but basically this is a story about trauma. It's about a brother and sister who experienced trauma. And particularly, he went through an abusive relationship, and basically the guy he was with, who was older, killed somebody. And we kind of get hints at this throughout. I don't want to go into too much detail. Obviously, I don't want to ruin the story. But yeah, he essentially killed someone, or, it's hinted at. And then, the relationship was very toxic. And so he is struggling with his own wellness, and he's had, issues. And his sister, who is younger than him, but kind of always sort of looked out for him, and they were really close before this drama happened, is still trying to, figure out her own life, who she is, because her brother kind of abandoned her after the trauma, and she wants to still be his sister, but they're, far apart emotionally, but she's still trying to be there for him. So there's a lot. It's a really small book, and there's a lot going on here. And I just thought this was a very, beautiful, evocative story about trauma, and about how certain kinds of trauma, even though the brother experiences, the toxic relationship and physical abuse and, a lot of those traumas, his sister's also processing certain trauma. And how, it's despite wanting to connect to each other, they're both kind of maybe too far gone. Are they too far gone, And the book ends very abruptly in a way that I really appreciated, but I also think can be very frustrating for some readers, because it's realistic. It ends kind of leaving you not sure what has been resolved in this relationship between them. And I enjoyed that, but it's kind of sudden, and like I said, it doesn't neatly tie up a lot of plot points and stuff, so it could be frustrating for some people. But very much enjoyed this book. This is a more recent read, and I kind of want to talk about it some more. So that was that one. The next one is Shattered Earth, a book that made you feel damaged and broken. And I'm going to go with a little life, because I think everybody who reads this feels damaged and broken. This book made me so emotionally, it upset me so much. I mean, in a good way. I love this book. This is one of my favorite top 100 books of all time. I really love it. I know some people say it's, misery porn or trauma porn. I really loved this book, and I don't see it that way. But it is miserable. It is about a person who nothing works out for. Nothing goes well. I mean, I can't say nothing. I mean, there are good things in his life, but he can't see them because, he has severe PTSD. He has a lot of mental health issues, and no matter what goes well, he's always going to have that hanging over him. And it's a really, really insightful portrait into mental health, and how no matter what happens in someone's life, there are certain things that they just can't become free of. And in a lot of cases, for many people, obviously those traumas and those hurts, um, they do shape you, but they could also help you kind of become better. And, in plenty of ways they do, but you can see that, Jude, the main character, he's never, no matter how strong his friendships are, no matter what kind of relationships he has, um, his life is never going to be fully healed, just because of what has happened to him. So I did a whole thing on this book, and I mean, I love this book a lot, but yeah, if you're going into this, I mean, it's almost like 700 pages or something. It may even be longer than that. So honestly, if you're going into this, and you get past, the first 20% or something, I mean, and you are going to commit to this book, I feel like you probably know what you're getting yourself into. But no matter how much you know what you're getting yourself into, there were times, and I love dark and depressing books. I mean, there were times where I was reading it on my Kindle, on my phone, and I would toss my phone aside and was yelling at my phone, no, how dare you, don't do this. You get very invested in these characters' lives, and it's very emotionally damaging. So just be prepared if you do decide to read it, but I highly recommend it. I love this book. So the next one is Sickness, and this is a book where the main character has a disease or disability, and this was kind of the thing ways back. There was a lot of YA about people with sicknesses and disabilities and terminal illness, but I wanted to go with something a little different, where the disease and the illness is impactful. It has a huge impact on the overarching story, but it also isn't the point of the story, because I think a lot of those books, are basically this whole story is about the sickness. I mean, we could have gone with A Little Life, because he has a disability as well, but I'm going to go with Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney, because this book is about a girl who has a heart disorder, and it is important to the plot of the book, but it's not the point of the book, and so that's important. I think it's, you want it to feel like it matters, that you're not just here's a character with, I mean, it's weird, if you have a character with illness or disability, and they're just there, that's fine, but, you also still want to make sure it's, they're there for a reason. You're not just trying to be oh, look, I'm diverse, and not addressing it, but also you don't want it to be the plot. The plot should not be their disability. I mean, unless it's particularly about the disability. But this does affect, the outcome of this story, but it also isn't the point of the story. So the next one is Good, Humane, Brave, and this is a book that warmed your heart. And I don't read a lot of books that warm my heart. I like a lot of really dark and depressing books. Every so often I do something fun and light and cute, though, and so I'm going with what was probably a very fun, light, cute book, but I love this book, and this is 13 Little Blue Envelopes by Maureen Johnson. This is just a story about a teenage girl. She's finishing her senior year in high school, and she's always been sort of introverted, socially awkward. She just hasn't figured her life out yet. And I think at one point, it was in my top 100, I think I said, or at some point I mentioned this book, I think I said that it was her grandmother. I think it might have actually been her aunt, but basically this older woman in her life, a family member, dies and leaves her 13 little blue envelopes, and they're those airmail envelopes. And essentially the first one says, go to London and you'll get the rest of this. And so essentially the book is this scavenger hunt through Europe, and she's on her own, summer before college, and really gets to just go off throughout. And this has been planned because her aunt or grandmother or whatever was aware she was sick. So she knew she was dying, and as she knew she was dying, and, and of course the main character knew this person was dying as well, so it's not like, but like this was kind of like her last gift to her. So she set this whole thing up, and she has all these friends and connections of people, because she had this really exciting life. And so this teenage girl essentially goes all around Europe, meeting people who had known her aunt, who had been friends with her, and they basically have like these pieces of the scavenger hunt set up for her, but it also gives her a lot of room to kind of explore on her own and build her own story and her own experiences. And it's just a lot of fun. I mean, I love travel. I love Europe, and I think it's just a really light book, but also it's not light and empty. And she's discovering herself, and she's finding her identity, and, she's really coming to terms with her relationships with other people, and, building her own confidence. And so there's a lot of good here. And it just really, I mean, obviously it warms my heart because I love seeing, this character come into her own, but I really also think it was really sweet of her aunt or grandmother or whatever to leave her this as a gift. I mean, I guess it's a little like P.S. I Love You. I think that movie which might be based on a book, where that guy leaves his wife essentially letters after he dies, because he's dying, so she can go through Ireland and learn about him, or his childhood or whatever. So similar kind of in that vein. So it's obviously meaningful, but also it's just really fun. I mean, who doesn't want to go on a scavenger hunt and travel around Europe for a summer? So great read. Really enjoyed this one. The next one is Evil, and this is your most hated character. And this one took me a really long time to figure out what I wanted to say, and what book I was going to use. Because the problem is, a lot of my favorite books, most of my favorite books, don't necessarily have a villain in the traditional sense. Either the villain is, the person themselves and dealing with their own, I'm very much, out of the different, conflicts, man versus himself, man versus society, man versus nature, man versus man. My favorite is man versus himself. I'm all about, personal character-driven, self-conflict. But I'm also, even in stories, like A Song of Ice and Fire, where it's man versus man or man versus society, I also really love those books that are full of gray characters. So there's not really a good character or an evil character. And, the people that you might be rooting for may be, kind of the good people, but then also, the villains are, understandable, and you can kind of get their perspective, but you're also sort of, not on their side because you want the people you're rooting for to succeed. So, a little more antagonist more than a villain. Plus, I think villains are really fun. So, in movies and stuff, a lot of times you like the villain. They're, more interesting, definitely in comic books. So, I really debated about this. And what it came down to was a book where there are just two characters who are just despicable human beings, and that I honestly, feel are just horrible, just awful people. And the book that I'm going with is Of Mice and Men, and the characters are Carlson and Curly. And the reason is, and I'm not going to go into too much in case it's spoiling. I mean, the book's been out for 100 years, so you should probably read it. It's 80 pages. And, I don't want to, but I'm not going to spoil it, because it is obviously a really impactful ending. But a lot of the stuff the whole theme here in this book really is about, there's a couple themes, but, one of the themes is about groups of people who are considered sort of useless in the face of society. So, you have, in the book, you have somebody who's disabled, a former slave, and a woman, all of whom are an old person. In society's eyes, especially during the Great Depression, these people are useless. They're a waste of space. And I'm not, believe me, by no means am I trying to say that people who are disabled or, people of color or women, that they're useless. I'm saying in like the context of this novel, and I don't think Steinbeck thought they were useless. I think he's just trying to say is that, like, there's this social demand essentially that you be a certain way. And, George and Lenny, the two main characters, George is kind of, he fits in, he belongs, he's part of society. But his best friend is, developmentally disabled, and he is not, a productive part of society. But he is, because he's strong, and he's, and that's really useful in the Depression where there's a lot of manual labor. But he also has issues because he doesn't understand certain things. And so the story, you see at one point where, like, all the guys go into town drinking, and they leave behind Lenny, and the stable guy who's black, and the wife of Curly, and the old man, and they leave them all behind. And the reason being that they are not considered useful. And that theme comes up again in two really key scenes that I don't want to detail if you haven't read the book, but if you have read the book, you know what I'm talking about. There's one that sort of parallels the ending that occurs about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the book, and this is something that Carlson's been arguing throughout the book to do something, this event. And it's horrible, and it shouldn't have happened. And the only reason that Carlson wants to do this is because he's saying that this is, essentially reiterating that point, that resources and money and food and space should only be reserved for those that give back and those that are useful. And that is then further reiterated towards the end at the end of the book. And again, I know I'm being kind of vague, but I really don't want to ruin this for anyone who hasn't read it. I feel like a lot of people have read it because you read it in, like, school, or you read it in, like, 8th grade or 9th grade, or, but, people maybe didn't, or they skipped that part of school, or they just didn't get to it, or their school didn't teach it. I know it's still banned in a lot of areas, so I don't want to ruin it because it's so good, and it's so short, and, if you really want to, like, jump into a classic, it's a great one. Most people really like this book. So, yeah, and it has a lot to say, obviously. But I would say that Carlson and Curly are probably despicable human beings and the worst characters I've ever seen. Not like bad writing, just the worst people that I've ever seen in a book. So the next one is Struggle to Survive, and this is a character or book where they put aside morals to survive. And this actually works out really well because I read Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns, and one of the things as I was warned about is our protagonist is a horrible person. And it opens, I will say, I was a little like, you don't need this. It opened with our 14-year-old protagonist who's essentially a prince, and they have, like, taken over a village, and, they've lit everything on fire, and there's one point where they go off and, like, rape the women, and I was like, really? Within the first 3 pages, we got a rape scene, and it's not graphic, and it's hinted at rather than, like, described or anything, it's like happening off camera, so that's the only reason I think I probably would have been like 3 pages in, I'm not in, if it was detailed, I probably would have left, because it's a little early, I'm like barely invested in the story. But, and again, I'm not sure that's necessary, but I think if you get over it, just get past it. The point is there, and the point is that this character is doing these horrible things. He's a teenager, and he doesn't care about, like, people being raped, he doesn't care about murder, he doesn't care about people's feelings, he doesn't care about anything. And there is a little bit of a twist towards the end that I didn't necessarily, like, feel like I needed. I would have been happier without it. But essentially the characters are really unlikable and he's immoral. But a lot of it is because he witnessed his mother and his brother be brutally murdered when he was a child. And so he's essentially grown up realizing that if you love anything or you care about anything, that just gives your enemies somebody to, it gives them leverage. And, if he ever wants to survive and if he wants to be essentially, hold his position, he has to be heartless and cruel. And again, like, it's a fantasy novel, but I think what I really liked about this book is I thought it was, like, kind of relevant and relatable even outside of a fantasy environment, and that being that, sometimes when people experience significant trauma, that the only way to, like, not experience constant PTSD is to sort of shut down. And so I thought he was very realistic, and I liked that, and I liked that it was, a character that was just trying to survive, because I think that's more realistic than, like, these perfect heroes when, like, most of us would just be trying to get by. So the next one is Absent Technology, and this is a book that makes you think about life without gadgets. And there's a lot I thought about using. I love Victorian literature. I love classics. So, I could just go to any book that was written before there were gadgets. But instead I'm going with a book, and it was written before gadgets. But I'm going with a book that might seem a little weird. But I'm going with it. And I actually don't know if I finished this book, and I had a whole thing about it with a couple of Stephen King things. I don't think I ever went back and finished the book because I had watched the miniseries, started the book, read a lot of it, but I was like, this is very similar. My friends were like, it doesn't really change. It's basically, and so I was like, well, I'll get back to it someday. And then another movie came out. So I don't know. I don't think I ever finished this book. But one of the reasons I'm picking this is because, and I probably could have picked anything like from this time period, but what I really love about it is actually like the Losers Club. Like, I love the 80s, well, it's the 50s. Obviously in the book it's the 50s because it's set now, which is the 80s, in the 80s. But, now when they remade the movie, they set the 50s scenes in the 80s and then the 80s scenes now. So that might be confusing, but if you've read it, you know what I mean. But, essentially the group of kids, it's just they're spending their summers riding around on their bikes, hanging out with each other, getting bullied, dealing with, like, kid stuff. And it just makes me think about my own childhood. And, I did grow up without gadgets, without a lot of technology. And, I talk a lot to my husband about how, like, we would just, like, get up in the morning, get on our bike, ride off to our friends' houses, and no one would hear from us all day or night. And no one cared. Like, no one knew where we were. We would be like, oh, we're going to our friend's house. But then, like, we'd get to our friend's house, and then we'd all hop on our bikes there, and then we'd go off to, like, the store or get pizza or go to the ice cream stand, and we just ride around town. And, part of it's because, and I think you see this a little bit in Stephen King's books, he does a really good job of this, is, when a small town, everyone kind of knows each other, especially back then, and so you didn't need a lot of technology and surveillance because he's like, if somebody saw me, like, there was a chance I could run into anyone. I could run into a teacher. I could run into one of my parents' friends. I could run into one of my friend's parents, or somebody would see us. So if we ever didn't come home, like, there would be a lot of places to start because they would know, like, where our regular places were. People would remember if they'd seen us. If we had ever, like, fallen over on the side of the road off our bikes and hurt ourselves, chances are somebody we knew would drive by. It was just, obviously, I don't want to say it was a different time, but, I don't think safety was a little different. But, again, I think, like, abductions happened just as much, if not more, back then. So, but yeah, like, it was a very, so our summers were just so, like, we had so much freedom. And, sometimes, I love technology. I'm, like, definitely I'm like a very weird, like I'm kind of a Luddite, but I'm also sort of like, I have a smart technology and everything. Anything that's going to make my life easier, I'm not going to complain about. But I do also feel like in some ways we're like, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Before Sunrise, but there's a point where like Ethan Hawke's character is talking about how like we we build all these things to automate our lives to save us time, but then when we look at it, we're like, well, what did we save that time for? What are we doing with all that time we saved? And it's kind of like the same thing with like technology. It's like, well, we have all these new gadgets and all these devices, and we can do all these cool things with them, but what have we lost to have those? And I mean, yes, there are advantages. I mean, obviously, but at the same time, like, have we lost some of those things? And so you get kind of like, especially when you're my age and you grew up without them, you start to kind of like think about like, were there things that were better? Is there a way to kind of find that happy medium? But anyway, I thought I couldn't help but think of this because this was just, my experience growing up. I mean, minus the, the killer clown in the sewer and the spider monster. Like, riding around with my friends, just, having total, like, freedom. And, there was just, it was very simple. And so, yeah, that's that one. And the next one is Societal Collapse. And this is the darkest, most depressing book you've ever read. And I've already covered pretty much one of the darkest, most depressing books I've ever read. And like I said, that's kind of my thing. So what I consider dark and depressing probably has to be super depressing, because I love books that are dark and depressing. Like, I think a lot of people would argue Gone Girl is a very dark and depressing book, and it's one of my favorites. Less Than Zero is one of my favorites. I just really like dark fiction. So I'm going with a book I also really liked. But I do think there's no like hope in it, and that was, I think, my defining point here. In A Little Life, I would have used it a second time, but I'd already used it. And this is Confessions, and I'm not going to say this name right, but it's Kanai Minato, I think. It's something like that. That's how you say it. I don't know how to say it, but I'm just reading it phonetically. This book, the reason this book was so dark is that, so it's about this girl, little woman, who is a teacher, and she has a child, and through a series of events, her child dies at school. And she essentially blames some of the kids in her class. And it's questionable throughout the book. I mean, we get information, but like, at first you're kind of like, did this happen intentionally? Did the kids intend to kill her daughter? Was it an accident? But she is determined to get revenge on her own students. And so what she does to get revenge is so messed up. And the series of events that follow, what's really interesting about this book is you get, it's already a short book. It's, basically a novella. And then in the novella, there's almost like 6 short stories. I think it's 6. And those are the different perspectives all about this event. And it's not like different perspectives of the same timeline like you usually get. It's different perspectives. So it's like the teacher's perspective, and then one of the students' perspectives after, and then a family member of another one of the students. And so it's kind of like the story is progressing chronologically, but you're also like adding more and more detail because you're kind of expanding the story while it moves on chronologically. And that's the best way I can describe it. But honestly, when you finish the book, you're just left like, wow, that's so depressing, because there's no like redemption for anyone. I mean, it's just awful. Everybody in it is horrible, and everything that happens is horrible. And it's a great book. I really enjoy it. And again, this is my thing, is I really like dark fiction. And so it's hard because I'm not saying you shouldn't read any of these books. I love these books. I'm just being honest. It's dark. And the last one is Fresh Beginnings. And this is a book with a perfect opening paragraph or chapter. And I was really debating. I know I'd already talked at one point about how beautiful the beginning of Book Thief is. And I don't know if it's like the first paragraph, it's just like the chapter. And not every part of the first chapter, but I just remember that first chapter standing out to me, and I was like, I'm going to love this book. So instead, I'm going to go with, instead of like a paragraph or a chapter, I'm just going to go with the first line. And it's the first line, my favorite first line of all time. And the first line, this is from 1984 by George Orwell, which is not even one of my favorite books. I mean, I like the book, but I would say it's like a solid, like, 3.5 to 4, just because there's a lot of parts of this book that I mean, it's a fairly long book, and there are a lot of parts that I felt like were just not that fun to read. But the overarching themes of this book, and like having read it, it's amazing. And I feel like that's a lot. I think I've mentioned this before, is a lot of times I really like literature, like the classics, when I read them in school, because I like talking about them. I like, like Lord of the Flies is a perfect example. Is I really do not like that book. I don't like reading it. I don't like anything about it. But I love having discussions about it. So, like, I've been in so many great conversations about the themes of Lord of the Flies, and I think the themes are amazing. I just don't like the book. I don't like the way it's written. I don't like the characters. I don't like the plot. I don't enjoy it. I enjoy nothing about it, but I love the concept and, like I said, the themes. So 1984 I like more than that. Like, it's not that I dislike it. I just, again, I think the themes and the overarching story and what you get out of it and the conversations you can have, all of that is way better than the actual, like, reading of this book. So, like, the book is solid. But it has the most beautiful opening line. I don't even know if it's beautiful. It's my favorite opening line in all of literature. And the line is, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And the reason I like it is I just feel like it's so, like, it's just how you can get that kind of world building so quick, because you're automatically like, striking 13, that's weird. And, you know, it's interesting. You know, I mean, again, you could go, oh, do they mean 13, 1 o'clock? Is it, military time? It's just, and I mean, a lot of the theme of this book, obviously, is that reality isn't reality, and that, like, other people tell you what reality is, but it just really got, like, the tone so, like, instantaneously. And, like, there's so few books that you can just read, and, like, instantaneously it sets a tone. Sir Chunk would argue the best opening page of all time is, he always says it is Fahrenheit 451, and I agree, it's beautiful. But I didn't want to steal his, and also this is my favorite line. So, yeah, so that's where I'm at. So that's those. I don't know if you've done the tag, consider yourself tagged. I'm sure Cliff would love to hear your responses. And yeah, see you around. Bye.